Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening to all of you, wherever you are, since we have, participants really from many countries today. I could see we have from United States, Canada, Germany, Azerbaijan, Croatia, Greece, Turkey, Pakistan. So, a very global audience. So to all of you, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adriana Pizzi, JCC Membership Coordinator, and I will be your moderator for this engaging discussion on developing socially sustainable tourism, embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. First of all, I would like to say that I'm a little bit sick, so my voice is going to be a little bit weird and also my energy a little bit low. But I hope I will be able to give my best. And if I say something that you don't understand because of my low energy or weird accent because of my nose, just let me know and I will just repeat it. So today it's a public session. So we have a very diverse audience that includes both JCC members and non-members. And these, as all of our open webinars, this session is being recorded and will be available afterwards on our YouTube channel. This way, you can share it with all the colleagues that couldn't join us today. And before we dive into today's discussion, I'm pleased to share some exciting news. That is that the registration for our upcoming JCC conference in the beautiful destination of Sentosa, Singapore is officially open. Our conference will be held from November 13th to the 16th of this year. And we've seen over 500 participants in this conference that will attract representatives from diverse sectors, including the public sector, hotels, tour operators, companies, academia, development agencies, online travel agencies, and non-governmental organizations. And over the course of 4 days, attendees can engage in a comprehensive program comprising a pre-conference training sessions, interactive panels, workshops, meetings, and social events. So don't miss out on this chance to register and secure your spot. I will be sharing the registration links to you via the chat. Looking forward to see you there and meet in person and not remotely anymore. And now moving to our main objective of today, it's my pleasure to introduce you to So-Yeon Park, our esteemed speakers for today's session. Dr. So-Yeon Park is an assistant professor in the Hospitality and Tourism Management program at Florida Atlantic University, where she also served as an affiliate faculty member with the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative Center. She earned her PhD in tourism management with a graduate minor in social data analytics from the Pennsylvania State University and holds a master's in economics from Korea University. Dr. Parks brings an interdisciplinary perspective to her research, integrating data analytics and econometrics to address social issues within the tourism and hospitality sector, particularly those faced by under-recognized populations, aiming to foster a more inclusive tourism industry. So I'm very excited to have Dr. Park with us today to share her insights. And following her presentation, we'll have time for a Q&A session. So please feel free to share your questions anytime during the webinar by using the Q&A feature that is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or the chat, or you can raise your hand at the end and I can unmute you and you can just ask your question directly to Dr. Park. So now, without further ado, let's welcome to Dr. So-Yeon Park. You may proceed to share your screen.
Thank you, Adriana, and hello, everyone. It is great to see the global audience zooming in on the webinar, and I see that we have an FAU alum, Go Owls, right? And let me share my screen so that we are diving right into our webinar. So today's webinar is titled Developing Socially Sustainable Tourism, Embracing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I was going to start with my introduction, but since Adriana gave such a great introduction on my behalf, I'll just repeat my name. So my name is So-Yeon Park, and I bring interdisciplinary approach to understand the under-recognized populations in tourism and hospitality using data analytics. So what are we doing today, right? So I'm very excited for today as we are going to dive into critical intersection of socially sustainable tourism and the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion in this webinar. We'll discuss the significance of DEI in tourism and explore how DEI principles contribute to the development of more sustainable and community-driven tourism. And this webinar will also provide an opportunity for us to examine strategies for integrating DEI principles into sustainable tourism planning and development, possibly for your specific organization. And I divided the webinar into two parts. So part one, we'll talk about the definition and principles of sustainable tourism and explain how DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, falls into the context of socially sustainable tourism. Right. And we'll briefly talk about the intersectionality of our identities as well. And in the second part, we'll try to apply the principles that we learned and plan strategies to develop more welcoming and respectful tourism together. So let's dive right in. I'm sure many of you have already seen this triangle or the circle, like a diagram of sustainability. Right? Sustainability aims for the long-term viability of a society and its institutions and practices. So achieving sustainability requires these three pillars: the economy, the ecology, environment, nature, right? And lastly, but not least, the social cultural aspects. We often see that prevailing systems for decision-making in the policies, planning and management levels, they tend to separate these three and mainly focus on the ecology, the environment, and economy. And even in research as well, not just the policy planning, right? Social cultural aspects of sustainability tends to be slightly neglected. But for all of you joining this webinar, I know that you recognize the importance of social sustainability, right? And the social aspect of the sustainability pillars. And we're going to talk about that, right? How do we build socially sustainable world, but more specifically, the tourism, right? So I want to start this webinar with a slightly interactive activity. I hope this goes well. So my question to you is, what is socially sustainable tourism to you, right? What is the goal of building socially sustainable tourism? What do we mean when we want tourism to be socially sustainable, right? Who should be considered as a stakeholder, right? So you can use the QR code using your phone to go into this web page. It's called Padlet, where we can actually do a interactive real-time discussion. I shared an example here. So I wrote down socially sustainable tourism should consider the well-being of host communities and residents. How can I trying to see if we can go into that web page so that all of us can see what kinds of comments that we're getting.
You can copy the link in the chat if you want to.
Let me do that so that it's easier for you to access using your computer.
Yes. Sure.
That into the comment section. And here is, I'm hoping that you can see the screen. Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Awesome. So let's see. Okay. Acknowledge the local community and local resources, all stakeholders, but most importantly, the local society needs to be considered. Non-traditional or underserved partners in tourism planning and experiences. Love it, right? I'm loving all the comments that are coming in. And it'll be really interesting to even dive deeper. Who are these underserved partners in tourism planning and experiences, right? We need to respect nature and local culture, right? strengthen the local community and supporting its sense and quality of place for its peoples. Socially sustainable tourism should take into consideration the well-being and the impact of tourism on local population, tourism workers, visitors, as well as actors of the sector. So I see some commonality that we want to consider the local people, right? The local residents, the local communities, local culture, respect human rights in operational areas of tourism. Oh, I missed one. Equal economic opportunities and conservation of local cultures and natural resources. So you can see that it's really hard to separate the three pillars, right? They go hand in hand. Socially sustainable tourism should benefit local community, not only from the economic aspect, but also support and assist local culture and traditions, right? Maintaining that local culture and traditions, heritage, benefit everyone, the local community and the visitors, right? Another commonality here with the visitors, regardless of their abilities, local communities, employee and tourists themselves, equal accessibility. I see accessibility coming up multiple times, opportunities for travel and benefits for the local stakeholders, local residents, conservation of their culture, coexist and flourish, all right? Please keep sharing your thoughts into this Padlet. I can maybe share this after we end our webinar. But now let's go back to our slides. Oh, one more, just one more. While it will undoubtedly require social changes as the community scales up tourism, sustainable tourism doesn't push communities into changes that corrupt cultural and community patterns that are important to the community. So I see the overlapping ideas coming out with conserving the local culture, right? And traditions, inclusion, right? So let's compare what you have shared with what UNWTO has came up with, right? So, yes. So this is the definition, of the sustainable tourism by UNWTO. And the highlighted box is where the organization talks about the social sustainability, right? So respect the social cultural authenticity of host communities, conserve their built and living cultural heritage and traditional values, and contribute to intercultural understanding and tolerance. And I have to say, our audience captured every aspect of UNWTO's definition of social tourism, right? Socially sustainable tourism, right? All of you, kudos, awesome work. So we have a kind of a consensus and an idea of what socially sustainable tourism is, right? So sustainable tourism in whole is tourism that takes full account of its current and future economic, social, and environmental impacts, while also addressing the needs of visitors, the industry, the environment, and host communities. Yes, we are aware that social sustainable tourism is a multifaceted concept, right? It has the economic concept. We are a business, right? A lot of our stakeholders are businesses for profit, and we have to make sure that the tourism that we're building is economically sustainable, right? Financially viable. At the same time, we are optimally using the environmental resources, maintaining essential ecological processes, and helping to conserve natural resource and diversity. We're respecting social cultural authenticity of our host communities, as many of you have mentioned, right? Consider their living cultural heritage and traditional values and contributing to intercultural understanding and, more importantly, the tolerance. I think we capture that idea through inclusion. Right? And lastly, I kind of already mentioned about the economic part. So that will form the sustainable tourism for us. How does DEI play into this, right? How does diversity, equity, and inclusion which has become a slightly controversial concept, sadly, right? A political concept. But I personally believe that it should not be, right? It's not something that's political, right? Applying DEI, the idea of applying DEI and the goal of applying DEI in any setting is to help make people feel welcomed, understood, and belong, which all of us want. If you have ever came across the hierarchy, needs of hierarchy, right? Hierarchy of needs by Maslow, we know that there's one stage where we talk about needs of belonging. Right? We are social animals. We want to belong. We want to be loved. Right? We need to connect to lead a happy, fulfilling life, and that's what DEI aims to do. Right? And to do so, we need to be empathetic. Reach requires understanding, learning, and accepting people as is. So empathy and sympathy are two different things. Right? When you want to be empathetic, you have to accept what that person is feeling, right? Accept that person's thoughts, feelings, situation as they perceive it, right? We're not trying to silver line how they're feeling, right? I say that I feel very down. My career is not working out very well, and you saying, "Oh, at least you're healthy," right? That's not empathetic, right? Empathetic is trying to connect, trying to understand how that person is feeling. Maybe try to find within yourself that vulnerable experience or characteristic trait that you have that would make you feel that way as well, and trying to connect, right? And to do so, we have to be understanding and we have to be aware. So that's the goal of DEI, right? So we're going to start with the diversity. We'll go in order: diversity, equity, and inclusion, and see how that would connect to building socially sustainable tourism. Right? So let's start with diversity. So diversity, simply put, is the presence of different types of people. As we saw in our audience, we have lots of people from different countries and different nations. Right? I'm sure we have different genders, ages, abilities, and that's what diversity, simply put, would be. Right? However, diversity does not guarantee that you're listening or including them. Right? It's a starting point, right? But diversity without equity or inclusion can result in tokenism, where you're just simply treating people as filling a spot for an identity, right? Instead of considering them as doing a meaningful work and providing insightful thoughts, right? So diversity in workforce composition means stakeholder populations trust and feel represented by on all levels. Let's say a board of directors of 7 created 2 more seats to bring on 2 women. And those 2 women believe and trust that the group will help them feel heard and enabled. Is that board of directors diverse by gender? Maybe not. Not until, even if those 2 women feel that they are being heard and the 7 board of directors will treat them as inclusive and welcoming. Right? Not until the employees of that organization think so. Not until the institutional investors, or also stakeholders, believe so. Not until the general public or the customers think so. Right? So you have to ensure that there's a trust, right? Trust from stakeholders that the group is diverse. Right? In most parts of the world, people are unlikely to think that there is a representation until you reach more or less parity, right? 50-50 gender representation or close to it, until they believe that the board or the group is diverse in terms of gender, right? So it's trust, and it's often achieved through representation parity, but not always requiring it, right? To give an entity the definition of diverse, right? And we often focus mostly on the underserved, under-recognized, and marginalized populations, when we try to build a diverse group. And when we're thinking of identity, right, it's not just one thing, or it's not something that we can see visually, right? It's not just our age, it's not just our gender, it's not just our ethnicity, right? It composes of very different aspects. I am just giving out examples of more simple identities, right? Like age and gender, as you see in the bottom here, hospitality, right? We have a long way to go, even in the gender diversity. Right? According to Castell Project's Women in Hospitality Industry Leadership 2022 report, 60% of hoteliers are women, but only 10% hold leadership roles, right? We know that hospitality is heavily female. I know that's true for the US. I am unsure about all the nations in the world, but think back to your own country. Do you see more female or male workers in your hospitality and tourism field? And how about the leadership, right? Who holds the leadership positions? And during the Wyndham's first Black Hotel Ownership Symposium in also 2022, Von Irons, principal of Stonecrest Resorts, noted that of the 60,000 hotels opened in the US at the time, fewer than 2% were owned by Black people and less than 1% owned by Black women. Right. So these show you some examples of lack of diversity in our industry. But again, going back to that different identities, right? The intersectionality. Here's the example of a diversity wheel by Johns Hopkins University and Medicine. Center of the wheel represents the characteristics that are usually most permanent or visible, right? We see age, physical abilities, gender, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, identity, right? But the outer circle you see, right, more in number as well, that are sometimes acquired and changes over the course of a lifetime. We often think that our identity is a fixed concept, but it is not, right? We sometimes acquire an identity voluntarily or involuntarily, and they all form and work together to build ourselves, right? So as you can see, like political ideology, marital status, functional specialty, military experience, job classifications, native born, non-native, religious beliefs, socioeconomic status, thinking styles, geographic location, parental status, all these, right? They change over our life course and can affect our identity over time, right? And the theory of social identity, right? What they say is that we build our self-esteem and our whole identity with these intersection of different backgrounds and different characteristics that we form, and based on the communities that we are part of, right? For example, I am woman, I'm a mother, I'm a Korean living in the US, teaching in Florida, right? So all these little groups that I am part of form my identity. And when one of my identity is under attack, let's say being in a hospitality educator in Florida, right? There has been a lot of news articles about the negative work that hospitality educators have done in Florida and how bad we are, right? One thing I could do is fight back those conceptions, like presumptions, or second is actually leaving that identity, right? There are some of the identities that we can leave behind. Most representatively, our jobs and careers, which was one of the reasons why we saw a lot of hospitality workers and tourism workers leave the industry during the pandemic, right? We were under a lot of scrutiny for furloughs, layoffs, and not very pleasant working conditions at the time and low pay. And some people thought, you know what, I don't want to be associated. with this because it is affecting my self-esteem. And they left the industry entirely, not just their position, right? They left the whole industry when to move on to another industry, right? So we have to think back to yourself, right? What kind of identities do I have? And how does that intersection of those identities form how I think, how I speak, how I behave, and how I am treated by the society, right? So that was a diversity, right? Now we know that we need to have the representation of different groups from different identities, different backgrounds to have a diverse workforce. And that's the starting point, right? Then we move on to equity, right? I'm not sure if I should stop for any questions, but if you do have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them on the chat, right? Equity is the measured experience of individual, interpersonal, and organizational success and well-being across all stakeholder populations, and the absence of discrimination, mistreatment, and abuse for all. Right. So simply put, it's fairness. And I like to emphasize that it's the absence of discrimination and mistreatment, right? It's not just that we have everyone there, but we are making sure that we're eliminating these structural barriers that are resulting from historical and present day inequities. Right? Can you guys think of any structural barriers that your country or your organization, your group may specifically have? Or maybe you have experienced yourself that structural barrier. Think back while you think. I can give you one example of international students, right? There are structural barriers for international students in the US, right? The visa issues. It is very difficult for international students to get a job in the US because they get 1 year if they are non-STEM. If they are STEM, the science, technology, economic, math, I think, you get 3 years until you have to actually get the actual visa to work. So you have 3 years of, I would just say, trying to get your actual visa. But that visa doesn't come to you easily. Right? You need a good sponsor. You need to spend a lot of money to apply for that visa because you need a lawyer. And unless you are supported by a large institution like schools, colleges, you go into this lottery system, right? And if you don't win the lottery, you don't get the visa, right? So it's a lot of risk being an international student trying to get a job, right? And that can be considered a barrier, right? And it is important that we recognize these structural barriers, right? We know the historical discrimination have existed for not just recently, centuries, right? And these can affect our compensation, our opportunities for advancement, daily work experiences, and visitor experiences and access. I am going to show you this picture. I'm sure you have seen this picture many, many times, right? When we're part of a majority or dominant group, right, we tend to have the privilege to not think about who we are, and we just have the privilege to be provided with things without explicitly asking for it, right? Me being able-bodied, right? I never had to even think about accessibility to buildings. I could walk up, I could open the doors without anyone helping me. I could get on a bus, get on a metro without any issues, right? But we have to always recognize that no one goes through life 100% or 0% privileged, right? I was on a cast for a brief time. That opened my eyes to the situation of accessibility, I guess, or the status of accessibility or lack thereof in Korea transportation systems, right? So as I cannot ascertain if you are in the mostly the predominantly privileged groups or not. But if you are in the privileged groups, right, we have to become an ally. You have to become an ally to ensure that everyone, right, without a privilege or with privilege, have access to the resources and the quality of life that we lead, right? So you can see the equality is just giving everyone the same thing, but equity is ensuring that we are adjusting the resources that we're giving to each individuals or the groups so that we are achieving things together, like riding a bike. Right? And when we talk about equity, I wanted to mention briefly about colonialism. Right? So colonialism, mostly associated with European powers' colonization of Asia, Africa, and American nations. We might consider that passé, right? It's past. But tourism from its beginning, we have had an intertwined relationship with colonialism, right? Many popular destinations across the world were once either colonies, regions significant to colonial powers, or regions significantly influenced by colonial powers, right? And that colonial era shaped the culture, the architecture, the infrastructures for our popular tourism destinations, right? And the remnants of colonialism still prevails in the tourism industry, and we often call that neocolonialism, right? The West continues to exert dominance over non-Western countries in economics. So I'm using the West as more of a conceptual word here. It can be the global North, global South. We see developing or developed connotations, but I am using the West and the non-Western here. So I want to give you an example from my personal perspective as in tourism academia. Right? So tourism knowledge production, tourism, and especially in the academic knowledge production, is heavily affected by neocolonialism. Right? The education and training of tourism scholars, they often happen in Western countries, especially the US and European institutions that are highly ranked, and many students from all over the world move to the countries to get their education, right? And their education system, the training procedure are again affected by the Western scholars. Then the creation and the evaluation of tourism knowledge, again, is affected by the colonialism remnants, right? We write, we read, we research in mostly English, right? I would say the 100% of the top 10 journals in tourism and hospitality are in English, which means that you're searching articles in English and you're writing your manuscript in English to be published in these esteemed journals, right? That means if you're not native, you have a disadvantage in being a successful scholar in the field. And here are some excerpts, I would say, I actually personally received from leading journals in tourism. This finding is okay for sub-Saharan region countries. I don't mean to say that these aren't important findings, but I don't see the applicability and generalizability outside the results. The authors should think more about the widespread context and knowledge significance of the results. So this paper looked at 48 countries' data in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And the rejection letter I received was based on its lack of generalizability because it can only be applied to sub-Saharan region countries. But we often witness a lot of papers being produced by looking at data from one university or one city, one neighborhood in the West, in the US, in Canada, in European countries, right? But this quote was such a shock to me that even though this included 48 countries, right? people considered it ungeneralizable. And I would have to say this was more of a misconception and a bias, like innate bias that they had, right? And the second quote, mindful of you that a journal is an international journal, but not a local magazine. If the author insists using data from Beijing, the paper should be submitted to Journal of China Tourism Research. This was actually my collaborator's paper, and he received this letter from the journal, right? So we never question, we tend to not question when a study is done in Western countries like the US, as I have mentioned several times. There's no Journal of US Tourism Research, American Tourism Research, right? It's just Journal of Tourism Research, JTR, right? And this is an innate bias that we have formed through this colonial era, right? We believe that the knowledge produced in the West is the theory, the golden rule, where the knowledge that's produced in rest of the world are more of case studies that are trying to prove and support that theory, right? So here is an example of how in many cases, when we write a paper using other countries' settings, they tend to include that in their title, right? And also try to provide extensive explanation of that region and rationalize, right? So familiarity and novelty and aesthetic appreciation, the case of intangible cultural heritage in China. And I also tried to look for a paper that talked about cultural heritage. And here you don't see a country's name in the title, right? And this was one of the European countries. And sensory therapeutic assemblage in tourism, QI, and the health of snowbirds in China. Again, we see China here. And on the right hand, we see retired snowbirds, and this is one of the states in the US. The data was one of the states in the US. So we noticed that even in the knowledge production, we see the presence of historical structure barrier, right? And if it is so embedded, what do we do, right? We cannot just fix everything. We cannot uproot the colonialism that happened, right? And we cannot uproot the historical barriers that we have built throughout centuries. But the first step is being aware. We know that this is happening, right? We need to maintain and foster the concept, the state of constant alertness, right? We need to be aware, and that's our first step. And hopefully through this seminar, you start that awareness and build that constant alertness, right? And third, now we have inclusion, right? So inclusion is the achievement of an environment that all stakeholders, especially underserved and marginalized populations, trust to be respectful and accountable. So it is something that we believe and we are valued and respected, right? It's not just the representation. It's not just the lack of barriers and discrimination. It's the actual act of engagement, right? Actual act of respecting, asking for their thoughts, considering their well-being, making sure that people have access to decision-making, right? And that's how we build an inclusive environment that can be a basis for socially sustainable tourism, right? We are not just including people, the local community people, right? We're making sure that they're able to voice their opinions and that their opinions are heard and valued and incorporated into tourism policy making, right? So inclusive leaders must challenge biases. As we all know, we all have biases, right? We often believe that we don't have a bias. That's again a bias, right? It's in the communications literature, we talk about third person bias. where we believe that all these media content affects other people, but not me. So we'll say things like, oh, this propaganda, like political propaganda, should not be featured on TV because I'm okay, but my friends may be affected, my parents may be affected, right? And everyone thinks that way. That means all of us are affected, right? So that's a third person bias. And we have this conception regarding our own biases. We all believe that we don't have a bias and that our bias does not affect our behaviors or thoughts, but they do, right? We have these implicit biases that affect how we act and think. So whenever you have time, I suggest that you take this implicit association test, and it will open up your mind about how much biases that you may hold, right? So inclusive leaders, they should be aware of their own biases, conscious and unconscious, and they must take responsibility for inclusion and hold all employees accountable for inclusion in the workplace. If you are the leader of your organization, it will be your role to start the awareness trainings, right? Open up the places for discussion about inclusion, right? And build institutional strategies. Have the standardization criteria for hiring people, evaluating people, and promotion so that you are being inclusive, right? Just trying to be and just saying that you are going to be inclusive doesn't make it happen, right? We have to institutionalize it. And that's where the strategies come in. So that was our part one. So we talked about DEI and socially sustainable tourism, right? And how do we implement that, right? We're going to think about what kind of challenges we may have, right? This is just for you to, this is food for thought. Think about potential challenges that you may face when you're trying to incorporate DEI into your own country or to your own organization, your group, maybe your family, right? Now, what are the opportunities that you see? Maybe by applying DEI principles, you see your organization improving in certain aspects, right? And I'll give you some good examples of organizations doing socially inclusive tourism, right? So here's the example of City of Baltimore. They ask their Baltimore-based businesses and attractions to sign a pledge, right, to be welcoming, right, and being more inclusive. And the City of Baltimore, the Visit Baltimore would provide DEI training tools on race, disability, accessibility, and LGBTQIA+ to these businesses and encourage to apply those tools into their own staff training. And successful participants who go through the materials, their training tools, incorporating them into their own state training, they receive a warm welcome toolkit that will have like stickers, display materials, and buttons for their staff and the building, so they can show the customers that we have gone through this, we are welcoming you, you are safe here, right? And of course, it doesn't end as one-time thing. They also provide additional resources and training on an ongoing basis, right? And then we have Visit Lauderdale. It's very close to where I live, right? So I'm very excited to share the example of Visit Lauderdale. So they focus a lot on making sure that everyone is welcomed. And their slogan, as here you can see, is everyone under the sun, right? And globally, 1 in 6 of us live with a disability, right? And of those, it is estimated that up to 80% are living with a non-visible disability. And Visit Lauderdale tries their best to ensure that they're also considering visible as well as non-visible disability when they are welcoming and developing tourism programs for their region. As you can see, they have partnered with Sunflower as well as Will the World to provide information about businesses that are disability friendly, right? and provide enough information for them to plan their trip without much issue, right? Where if you have ever been to the website of the Wheel of the World, they give you examples like the ramps, the size of the hotel room, is it wheelchair friendly, how's the noise sound, right, noise level, and so on. And of course, they provide information about LGBTQ plus multicultural travel as well for those with different identities. Right? So think back to your organization, right? How would you implement DEI? And where do you start? So I believe that these slides are going to be shared with the participants, and here are some of the practical strategies that you could refer to when implementing DEI in sustainable tourism development. Right? I'm not going to go through one by one because that's going to be a lot, but I'm showing you that there are resources that you can use. And also, this is my personal, I guess, promotion. I'm a board chair of Travel Unity, an NGO that tries to make tourism welcoming to everyone with all the backgrounds. And we built a standards that organizations can go through to check how they're implementing DEI in their own organization, right? We have criteria for management, workforce, visitorship, community impact, and it's not just small bullet points. We go in detail, right? Check if you have a well-defined publicly available mission. Mission defines the organization work in relation to the people it serves, as we talked about, right? It has to be all the stakeholders. So this, again, is another resource that you could tap into to assess how your organization is doing and how would you build a strategy to move forward, right? So I hope this webinar gave you some information that's useful for you, and I look forward to the questions and feedback from the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Soyeon, well, for sharing all these complexities of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and well, on the profound impact of neo-colonialism on tourism, or the insight that you gave into fostering fairness, respect, and cultural sensitivity within travel. Well, I guess it gave me, but I'm sure to all our participants, some thoughtful reflection on how we can cultivate more inclusive and equitable practices in the tourism industry. So let's start now with the Q&A session. If you have any questions that I saw we already have some, please write them in the Q&A box or in the chat box, or raise your hand and I will unmute you and you can ask your question directly to Soyeon. So I have first question here, and so if we understood correctly, while equality is about sameness and equity is about fairness, could you tell us a little bit more about it? How can tourism organizations differentiate between equity and equality when developing their policies and practices? And could you provide examples of initiatives that prioritize equity over equality within the tourism sector?
Yeah, of course. So equality and equity, right? So let's say the example of accessibility. Some tourists may require more assistance or further resources to access the same attraction. It could be a man-built attraction like Disney, or it can be natural attractions like national parks. Right? We know that national parks, especially in the US, they're for the people. It means that everyone should have access and everyone should be able to enjoy. But if we just say, hey, it's open, we have a trail, come by whenever you want, it does not ensure equity. It is equality, right? Everyone can go. But we make sure that some of the paths are accessible, or all of the path would be the greatest, but at least some of the paths are accessible through wheelchair, Some of the parts does not require advanced reservation. Right? A lot of national park campsites require almost 6 months ahead reservation to participate in a camping experience. Right? Some people may not have access or that luxury of planning 6 months in advance. Right? So we make sure that some of the campgrounds are first come, first served, and not restricted through reservation. Right. So those are some examples of the difference between equity and equality and how you could incorporate that into your tourism planning. And I see Tamar raised his hand.
Let me ask you this quick question, and then we go with Tamar. So we have a question. How should we approach DI where local culture sensitive are hurdle in DI implementation?
Yes, I fully understand. I'm in Florida. If anyone's aware of the situation in Florida, they should. We know. Yes, I know how sensitive DEI can be. I think it is really important to approach DEI the concept more of everyone has an identity that can be addressed and catered to, right? Maybe you are a healthy young man, right now, but in maybe 20 years or maybe even 20 days, you could get in an accident, right? So your identity is not something that is just permanent. It changes over time, changes over the course of time, right? And having that idea at least slightly opens people up to make sure that people of less privilege are catered for. I remember this quote from, I think it was Rousseau, where imagine that you are being born, right? You are being born into a society where there's nothing determined yet. You don't know if you're going to be born a privileged person or not a privileged person. And then you ask them, hey, do you want a society where non-privileged are also respected? Everyone's going to say yes, because they don't know who you are going to be born with, right? So giving people the idea that this could always benefit them as well, right? It also applies to them, right? It's also about me. That idea, I think, helps remove or decrease that barrier a little bit and that rejection to DEI, right?
Thank you.
I hope I answered your question.
Yes, well, I believe you did. Tamar, I'm going to unmute you so you can just ask your question directly. There you go.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Thank you so much, Sanyong, for excellent presentation and for discussions. It's very, very important for me. I'm Tamar. I'm from Georgia. I'm working on development of inclusive tourism, introduction of inclusive tourism more than 15 years in my country, Georgia, trying as much advocating as possible. Though there are international standards, my question is regarding the inclusive tourism. So developing inclusive tourism, it's very challenging in our country and beyond. So there are challenges on digital accessibility, physical accessibility, and services. Also knowledge and awareness among tourism industry. So what are the important directions to consider beyond the UNWTO? We all know that UNWTO has a lot of recommendations and also the guidelines available, the resources available, and we have also its recent ISO standards on accessible tourism, and there's an excellent standard. Though I'm trying advocating every possible direction, there are a lot of barriers still existed in tourism industry. How we can move forward, how we can have the positive changes. And thank you once again for excellent seminar and discussions today.
Thank you, Tamar. Yes, so when I actually had this similar discussion with governments from different countries, I remember Cambodia, Pakistan, Thailand, Ghana, multiple countries back in Korea, and they all shared similar concerns, right? And the standards that are shared by the US or UNWTO does not specifically apply to their context. And I believe this is true, right? Because a lot of standards and a lot of how would you say, indexes that we develop are by the Western scholars, right? I also work on these indexes and measurements and how to develop socially sustainable tourism, but in the context of the US at the moment, right? So you don't have to consider it as a golden standard, but you can use it as an example that can be applied to your country's context, your organization's context, and per removing those barriers, right? Always it starts with education and awareness. If you are an organization like TMO, you can build a toolkit, right? And disseminate among the businesses, organizations that are stakeholders in your tourism industry, and encourage them to use that to train their staff, right? And their staff interacting with visitors and local communities will also increase those awareness, right? So it all starts with the education, and the resource for building that education could come from the governments, the NGOs, the entities like DMOs that are, how would you say, more so working for the tourism industry in the region, right? And less for profit and like hotels and restaurants.
Thank you, Sayam. We have another question here regarding recognizing bias. It is important to recognize that you have bias. Are there any official training in recognizing bias that you are aware of? So yeah.
Yes, so I actually shared the link in the chat. It's the implicit bias test from Harvard University. So it takes it's not very short. It's not a few minutes. It will take some time for you to go through the bias test, but it will give you like a series of pictures that you choose back and forth, and it can test the implicit unconscious bias that you may have. And I can share more maybe with the slides.
Okay, I think we're running out of time, unfortunately, so I will just go with the last question that I have here. What preconceived attitudes might some tourists have that reflect neo-colonialism without realizing it? And how can tourist destinations, organizations educate visitors to promote more respectful and equitable tourism?
Yes, so educating tourists is very difficult, right? We recently saw, I think just like a day ago, right, a protest in Spain, right, asking people to go away with the water guns, and we are to blame for it. As tourists, right, we tend to not respect the local communities when we travel. We're changing. The trend is changing slightly, but it's slow. So how do we educate the tourists, right? And again, I have to say it comes down to the visitor-facing employees and people who are interacting with these tourists, right? And also with the educational institutions, the people that are educating them before they start traveling, right? Us, right? As educators, teaching them early on what it means to be intercultural, right? What it means to respect other people and other culture, right? So it starts with the early education throughout the college, and then the actual visitor-facing employees, like hotel employees, who are actually talking about their local culture, building the program to sustain local culture and showcase the cultural heritage and the traditions of that region, right? Building that into your tourism programs. I think that's what matters, because when you are aware of what kind of value that culture has, you're more likely to respect it, right? So many for-profit companies may not invest in building programs for the culture because it may not be as profitable, right? But it comes down to, again, the governments, the NGOs, government-related entities to invest in building those programs, right? So that tourists become aware of the value of your local culture, right?
Thank you, Senor. Well, unfortunately, this takes us to the end of this webinar. But before we conclude, if you're interested in delving deeper into the best practices in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I invite you to join me, because I already registered, to our upcoming Apply DI Travel online course. It's a 4-week course that begins in September the 30th. I personally registered to continue learning in this topic. So I will be sharing the link here in the chat if you want to gather more information about it. And well, before we leave, a big thank you to you, Soyeon, for these very insightful discussions. And a big thank you to all of you who joined us today and make it a priority to keep learning and growing in this topic. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a wonderful and extraordinary morning, day, or evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Talk to your friends, talk to your family members about this, right? That will help.
Okay, bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.